Good afternoon, everyone. Ask the members of the Menhaden Management Board to make their way to the table. My name is Robert Boyles from the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources. I have my first meeting here as chair of the Menhaden Management Board. Appreciate everyone being here. The first item on the agenda today is seeking your consent for the approval of the agenda, which was sent out to you in your briefing materials. We have had a request to add one item under other business from Jim Estes, so Jim will take care of that. Any other items for consideration for the agenda? Pete.
Mr. Chairman, I had brought up back in August that maybe at this particular meeting we might have an opportunity. I mean, we've learned a lot this year implementing these TACs, and it would be wise to listen to some of the other states as to any problems that they have encountered, be it underreportings, lower than expected TAC, hard to track down, how to put in regulations, and the 6,000 pound bycatch allowance, how big it's becoming. So maybe, I mean, I'm sure at the February meeting we'd have a better grasp of the entire year, but we certainly have encountered enough problems that we wouldn't hesitate to share with other members. Thank you.
Thanks, Pete. We'll see if we can get to that as time allows. Terry?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Related to Pete's point, I'd like to have some discussion, if not today, at our winter meeting about working with staff to track the quotas. New Jersey, for instance, Maine didn't find out about the New Jersey reaching its quota until we received it through industry. So there's got to be a way we can think through those logistics.
Okay, thank you. Any other items for the agenda? Seeing none, the agenda will stand approved as amended. Next item on the agenda is approval of proceedings of our August 2013 board meeting, which were distributed as part of the meeting materials. Any objection to approval of those meeting minutes? Seeing none, those minutes will stand approved as submitted. Next is time on the agenda for public comment for members of the public who would like to speak on items that are not on the agenda. Mike, do we have anybody? Okay, I'm sorry. We have one item on one individual, Ken Hastings. Mr. Hastings, if you could come forward to the public mic, identify yourself, and make your comments, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Ken Hastings. I'm a recreational fisherman from Maryland. I looked very carefully at the agenda, and I didn't see anything about accountability of catch reporting on there, so I came prepared to make a few statements about that today, if that's all right. I notice you're working it up maybe to have time later on, and maybe it's covered in the February meeting. I think the catch reporting, as some of you may have already realized, may not be adequate for a number of reasons, and you went to a lot of trouble to try to reduce the TAC, and to my way of thinking, that means you actually meant to decrease the number of fish that were going to be taken and not get involved in just some paperwork exercise that made you kind of feel good. So I was glad to see that. I know how this is done in Maryland. I know that traditionally catch reporting in Maryland is not very accurate and is done for the obvious reason of increasing the catch beyond the allowable quota. There doesn't appear to be a valid accountability method to keep that from happening. There's no reason to expect it isn't happening with Menhaden, since it happens everywhere else. And recently, Maryland went through a striped bass sustainability certification process that did not terminate as most people had hoped it would, because the agency doing the certification decided that there were deficiencies in the way Maryland handles bycatch of primarily striped bass gear, and they mentioned Menhaden in particular. Well, I thought maybe this was just a Maryland thing, and they're working on some things there to try to fix that, I know. But then I picked up this letter back here from Florida that indicates that historically up to 75% of the catch has not been reported at all. So that tells me that there's a lot of this underreporting going on, possibly. Maybe those are the only two. I'm doubting that. Even at that, legally, at 6,000 pounds per trip of bycatch, even if it's reported correctly, it'd only take a few days for the Maryland fishermen to catch the TAC over and over and over. 12,000 pounds, of course, just makes that potentially twice as bad. We need to ensure that we have a real reduction in order to evaluate how this is working. It shouldn't be a paperwork exercise with meaningless numbers, and we should be able to do better than this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hastings. Any other member of the public like to make comment? Seeing none, we'll move on our agenda. Mike Wayne is going to review the Episodic Event Set-Aside Pilot Program. Mike?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to spend a few minutes to refresh everybody's memory on this program, and then I'll move into reviewing how 2013 went. So this set-aside was written into Amendment 2 that we implemented in July of this year. And just a quick overview of how we got to this point. The board approved this set-aside back in December. Like I said, we implemented it in July. The board tasked the subcommittee of New England states because episodic events, which are events in which menhaden occur in higher abundance than they normally occur, was historic to the New England region. The board tasked the New England states to come up with a pilot program that would help address this need. And so the subcommittee did that and brought back a proposal in May, of which the board approved the pilot program for 2013. So we, as part of the provision of that, are reviewing that at this meeting right now. So let me walk through the eligibility. It was decided that only the New England states, Maine through Connecticut, would be eligible to participate in this set-aside program because this was historic to New England. And the interested states must implement the following mandatory provisions as part of the eligibility requirements, and those are daily trip level harvester reporting that would be submitted weekly to ASMFC. Remember, this is 1% of the overall tax, so we're talking about roughly 1,700 metric tons of this set-aside. So in order for us to track landings relative to that set-aside, there would be daily trip level reporting to the Commission. The episodic event harvest must be restricted to state waters, and states must implement a maximum daily trip limit no greater than 120,000 pounds per vessel. So as part of the qualification process, a state had to demonstrate that it met those mandatory requirements. So the process was that states resubmitted their implementation plans for Amendment 2, specifically outlining that they met the requirements of the set-aside program. And in August, the Commission issued a letter to the board identifying that the states of Maine, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island met those provisions and were qualified to participate in the program. So there were some New England states that were not interested at that point in qualifying for this program. So to declare participation, a state would monitor their state landings to determine if an episodic event occurs, and that is defined as any instant when a qualified state has reached its individual state quota prior to September 1, and also has information indicating the presence of unusually large amounts of menhaden in its state waters. So if an event is triggered in any of those states, they must declare to the Commission that it plans to begin harvesting from the set-aside. And that states, if they do declare participation, they are not eligible for de minimis status because they are gaining access to this set-aside amount. So I'm headed now into a review of what happened in 2013. So in August, Rhode Island declared participation in the program. Rhode Island is unique in which they have a spotter pilot program that evaluates the biomass in Narragansett Bay, and they had levels that began in May and continued through July of approximately 5 million pounds. So that was higher biomass than they normally saw during this time period. And in addition, historically, when menhaden occurred in large abundance in the spring and early summer, they returned in late summer and early fall. So they expected to see that abundance come back as well. Well, since that point, in August and September, biomass had been averaging 800,000 to 1 million pounds in Narragansett Bay. So they, as part of their progressive approach to manage Menhaden in Narragansett Bay, they have a 2 million pound biomass threshold. So commercial harvest remains closed until their biomass estimates from the spotter pilot data exceeds that 2 million pound threshold. So with biomass averaging levels that was below that threshold, they haven't reopened Narragansett Bay to harvest. So as a result, no directed landings have occurred with the set-aside, even though they saw that biomass earlier in the year. So just to give, now I'm transitioning back to the program. And so what is the procedure for unused set-aside? Well, if an episodic event is not triggered by that September 1 date, the quota immediately gets rolled back into the overall quotas for all the states and gets redistributed based on the historical allocation that we originally allocated all of the TAC with. But because in 2013 an episodic event was triggered in the state of Rhode Island, any unused set aside at the end of the calendar year will remain unused and will not be rolled over into the coastwide quota. So the justification for this measure is that Amendment 2 does not currently allow for quota rollovers because Atlantic Menhaden is experiencing overfishing. So just as another reminder, the set-aside also has a payback provision. If the set-aside is exceeded, any overages would be reduced from next year's set-aside. So in terms of overall review, working with the subcommittee before this meeting, we discussed the program and all of the information that I just went through a couple moments ago. And remember that this program has flexibility in it in which the board can change or edit the program through board action or the adaptive management addendum process. So back at our May meeting this year, when we approved this program, there was a motion to initiate addendum to fully develop the program for 2014 and beyond. That got postponed until we had some information on how the pilot program was going to run. So we are now reconsidering that postponed motion at this meeting as directed, not only from the program, but also from postponing of the motion. And then when I worked with the subcommittee before this meeting, they recommended extending the pilot program as is because it was difficult to evaluate the effectiveness after only 1 year. So that's a general review of not only the set-aside and the provisions, but also how 2013 went, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mike, thank you. Questions for Mike? Bill Adler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mike, did you indicate, or I thought I heard you say, that if an episodic event happens, then you don't get the rollover back into the group? But there was no episodic event, other than Rhode Island looked for one, but from what I read here, they never needed it or used it in the end. So it wasn't used, I think. And if it's not used, then why couldn't it go get rolled over? I didn't understand how that worked.
Yeah, thanks. So it's sort of a hindsight condition in the sense that we now know that those fish, as of today, have not returned back to Narragansett Bay as was anticipated. And so the date for that rollover was September 1. And so in expectation that a biomass that Rhode Island had observed earlier in the summer and in the spring and early summer, they were expecting those fish to come back, which is why they opted into participating in the program. So now that we know that, or as of right now, those fish haven't returned, we've gone past that September 1 rollover date. And so to answer your question, there was no directed landings from the episodic event set-aside, but there was a state that opted into the set-aside, and so up until this point, we were expecting landings to occur.
Pete, in check.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. My questions are on the same lines. I guess we're handicapped by the date because, well, I mean, what's the likelihood of fish showing up in Narragansett Bay? This is the end of October. Just the fact that they declared in essentially removes the option of redistribution, I guess. That's what you're saying? But I guess we have bigger problems than that to resolve.
That's the way I read it, Pete, as well. Further questions from Mike? David.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since I wasn't part of the process when the board adopted this, I was kind of interested in the term unusual abundance that's used in defining an event. And did the board characterize that? Is there a definition of what constitutes that in the plan and addendum?
Yeah, a question that seems to be coming up quite regularly. The way it's written is the states are monitoring their individual state quotas and using those quotas as recognition of whether an episodic event is triggered in combination with information that Menhaden are in their state waters in higher abundance than historically occurred. There's no defining estimates of what that threshold is, but like I said, in the state of Rhode Island specifically, there are thresholds that they've used to indicate whether the commercial fishery is open or not, and so they have a mechanism to decide whether they are seeing Menhaden in higher abundance than they normally occur. But there is certainly some inherent responsibility within the state to acknowledge whether, from their understanding of how landings have occurred historically, is this year an episodic one or not? So there is certainly inherent trust in the program that the states are able to do that effectively.
Further questions from Mike on the episodic event review for 2013? Seeing none, I think what we have to deal with from a parliamentary perspective, if nothing else, is there is a postponed motion that was postponed by this board that we agreed to postpone until we had data on what an episodic event looked like. That postponed motion was to initiate an addendum to fully develop the episodic event program for 2014, for next fishing year. That's the postponed motion. We also have a recommendation from the working group that's been looking at this that we simply extend for one more year the pilot program that we've got. So if that is the recommendation of the working group, if the board wishes to go in that direction, we would need to recall the postponed motion and perhaps make a substitute motion. Is there any interest in doing that? To dispose of the postponed motion. The postponed motion was to initiate an addendum to fully develop the episodic event program for 2014. Pat?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, with your help, with workmanship, we'll do that. So I move to remove the motion from the table. Okay, that's
how about a substitute, Pat?
Okay. Move to substitute the motion that's on the table with the following motion. Now your words, Mr. Chairman. Take the words of the.
I'm going to look to Mr. Stockwell over there because I think he's worked with this. Terry?
Very good. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Pat, for starting to tee this off. The working group did have several discussions, and as Mike reported, is recommending to the board that the pilot set-aside episodic event program be extended for at least another year. So I'm not sure. I just thought that we were going to move the motion, the table motion. I was going to make a motion to substitute. So I don't. Is that the correct verbiage?
That would be in order. Yes.
Okay. Then I move to substitute.
You have to remove it from the table first.
we are substituting a motion that is brought back on the floor. So we are looking for a substitute motion.
Okay. So then I move to substitute to extend the pilot episodic event set-aside program and until 2015 annual meeting or further board action.
Motion by Mr. Stockwell. Is there a second? Pat Augustine. The motion is to substitute, it's a substitute motion, to extend the pilot episodic event program until the 2015 annual meeting or further board action. That is any discussion on the motion? Mr. Abbott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't want to be a pain like I always am, but I think our first course of action should have been to remove the motion from the table so that it's now active, and then after we vote on that to remove it from the table, then the motion that Mr. Stockwell made is perfectly in order. We just really don't have a motion prior to this that we're dealing with.
I'm sorry, there is a motion, Mr. Abbott, there's a motion that is in the minutes from our meeting in May. That motion was postponed until this meeting when we had data. So a substitute motion is in order. Mr. Stockwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I provide a little rationale on behalf of the working group, and specifically why we're recommending until 2015. It's really given the gyrations that Rhode Island went through this year, and the fact that Maine didn't even have an opportunity to trigger an event. We came to the conclusion it will probably be several years until we can actually test out and evaluate the program. Should the board determine that we need to have further action before 2015, the board would be then, if this motion moves ahead, have the opportunity to respond at any time.
Mr. Borden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is the extension of the program a regulatory action? Does it require an amendment to the plan? That's the first question, and then maybe a statement after that, if I can get an answer.
I believe under adaptive management, by this board action, we can extend this. As it would go, Mr. Stockwell, I understand this would be for up to 2 fishing seasons.
Okay, because the one point I would like to make is that one aspect of this I'm a little bit uncomfortable with is this issue of having this program operate, the fish don't get caught, and they don't roll over. So essentially we're depriving the constituency of the value of the fish if the same circumstance arrives. And if there's a way to accomplish that, I think it would be worthwhile for the Commission to flesh that out. Thank you.
Further discussion? Representative Minor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this would mean the annual meeting in 2015 or at any time prior to that there was further board action, or any time after that there was further board action?
Before that.
Before.
Further discussions on the motion? I'm sorry. Bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If we pass this, which I'm in favor of, what happens to that part I brought up before, which Dave brought up? Is that stuck that way if we pass this, or is there room in the addendum, existing addendum, that can adjust that date? I don't know.
My understanding to David's question, and Mike, I'll look to you to correct me. My understanding is the addendum specifies that fish left in the water, not rolling over, was the intention of the management board. And so that is what is in the addendum now. A change from that direction would be a new addendum. Is that correct, Mike?
So let me just back up a couple steps and say, as written in Amendment 2, there's the flexibility for the board to adjust any provisions of this set-aside program through either board action or the adaptive management process. So that's specifically written into Amendment 2, that flexibility. Now, to answer the question, excuse me, to answer the question about the rollover, as it's currently written in the program, if no states declare participation in the episodic event set aside by September 1, then the set aside gets immediately rolled into the same year and allocated based off the same allocation that we used for the other 99% of Menhaden. If a state declares participation before September 1, and there is, or state or any number of states in the, that are eligible in the New England states, then any unused set aside at the end of the calendar year remains unused. And the justification for that was that the Menhaden stock is currently experiencing overfishing, and there's no rollover provision in the overall amendment for the other 99% of the TAC. If there's an overage that occurs, just to take it one step further, if there's an overage that occurs from the set aside, there is a payback provision to pay back that from the next year's set aside. So that's just to bring it full circle.
Russell, I looked right past you. I'm sorry. Russell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just like to know, is September 1 set in stone?
The board has the flexibility to change that date through board action or the adaptive management process. As it's written right now, it's September 1.
I just think that's fish lost to the commercial fishery, and that if in other words, if New England states one by one declare, then that's lost, because evidently we can't get what we need by September 1, so it won't be rolled over. So you're talking about 17 million metric ton of Menhaden. Is that correct?
So it's 1,700.
1,700.
Yeah, 1,708 metric tons
Right.
is the set aside, 1% of the overall TAC.
And as I understand it, it would be divided up between bait and reduction. Is that if it went back into the fishery?
Yeah, it would be allocated using the exact same allocation table as contained in Amendment 2 that we use to allocate the rest of the TAC.
Lewis, and then Pete, and then Pat.
I guess just a question, because I'm confused now. I thought, from my recollection, that we said that there was a date certain in the calendar year where the New England states would have to declare for an episodic fishery. And if that date came and went, the fish that would have been the 1% would go back into the coastwide fishery and redistributed to the other states. So there would be no loss to the industry of those fish. So there seems to be a confusion as to which way it goes. Because I don't recall us saying that it's a use it or lose it 1%. And so we need to get that clarified before we move any further. I would recommend, Mr. Chairman.
Lewis, you're exactly right. So if no states that are eligible actually declare into the set-aside by September 1, immediately that 1% set-aside rolls into the overall quota for every state. Now, if a state declares participation, which is what happened in the case of Rhode Island, and through through harvesting off of that set-aside, they don't end up harvesting the entire set-aside. Or in this situation, it happens to be there weren't any directed landings because those fish that they had seen in the early summer didn't return. Under the provisions of the pilot program, because that state opted in, and they were expecting to land off of that set-aside, any unused set-aside at the end of the year does not get rolled over because, and the justification for that as written in the program was there aren't rollovers for the rest of the quota because Menhaden are currently experiencing overfishing.
To that point, Mr. Chairman, thanks for that clarification, Mike. And that is an issue. And I think we just need to figure out, are there fisheries that occur, say, November, December? I would think there would be. There's got to be a time certain when the New England states know they're not going to catch fish. And then there's going to be a couple of months lag period of time that they could catch that 1,700 metric tons or whatever it is. Because we have a management plan in place to end overfishing, right? So just because we're not overfishing because we have the management plan in place. We may be overfished, but we're not sure. But we're not overfishing with our management plan in place. So I don't think we can say no rollover because of overfishing. So the 1,700 metric tons needs to somehow, or whatever portion of the 1% that's not caught, 1,000 metric tons, 1,200, need to go back to the industry and redivide it up amongst the states. It's not much, but for those of us that don't have a whole lot anyway, it might mean a few extra trips here and there.
Pete.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to go back and reread the pilot study, the language, because my impression was that if it was not used by September 1st, then it would be redistributed. And the September 1st date came from the Gulf of Maine, the days of the IWPs, when that was an episodic event. That was history. So, my recollection is that on September 1st, we'd be divvying it out in the percentages of each state's bait allocation.
Pat?
I'll take one step further, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. What's the likelihood of a state having several episodic events in a short period of time, and what would the impression be by other states who are not participating in 1,700 metric ton? And I'm not sure how you answer that question, Mike, but I'm not sure what our control mechanism is here. And I went back to and I tried to find the definition for an episodic event and when it's reported. And maybe I just missed it, but if you could clarify that one more time, I'd appreciate it. But again, the real question is, if an area has several episodic events in a very short period of time, does the flag go up and say, hey, whoa, what's going on here? And I think we need to know how to address that. Thank you.
Jack?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to speak to Lewis's last issue that he brought up. It seems to me that, last year when we set up this episodic event, none of us contemplated the situation that has occurred this year. That is, a state declared an episodic event, but then ended up not catching anything. I think we all thought once that event was declared, something would be caught and we would follow through with the rest of the management plan. But we're sort of in an in-between situation this year. And so it seems to me we need another date upon which to act. That is, a state declares an episodic event and then by some date ends up not catching anything, and then at that point the 1,700 tons gets redistributed as we had originally anticipated. It seemed to me to be a fairly simple solution there. Thank you.
Terry?
Yeah, thank you, Jack and Lewis. The intent from at least Northern New England was that 9/1 was the trigger date. If we would know by that point whether or not an episodic event was going to be declared. So like to amend this motion to add some language, I think that will address the issues that I've heard around the table. And it would be, following further board action would be, if an episodic event is declared before September 1st and not fully used, any remaining quota will be redistributed to the other states and jurisdictions. And I think that would allow it will address the issues that I'm hearing around the table.
Terry, I think you're further clarifying the motion. So can you we have that language? The question is, when's that second magical date that Mr. Travelstead referenced? How does the board wish to deal with that? Bob?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, one approach would be to redistribute in the following fishing year, but that would seem contrary to the anti-rollover provisions that apply to the coastwide quota in Amendment 2. So, but that would be certainly easier from a logistical standpoint, because I think one of the challenges here is redistributing either the full amount, 1,700 metric tons, or some portion thereof in a proportional way late in the season. I understand could be a logistical nightmare for staff, and we could be talking about a few 100 pounds of fish for some states. So I think that was one of the reasons why it was decided to go the route that the pilot program went. Given Mr. Stockwell's suggested motion, which I realize hasn't been seconded, so maybe I should stop talking until there's a second, and then I would like to perhaps revisit it. Thank you.
I was going to work to see if we could get it fleshed out, because this is a substitute motion as it stands. So, Dr. Pierce.
To your question, Mr. Chairman, in light of what was mentioned earlier on about when might be the last date by which an episodic event would occur, I would think it would be by the end of October. So I would suggest as a friendly that the motion to substitute could say after any remaining quota, and not fully used by October 31st, any remaining quota will be redistributed. So that would provide the 2-month period basically for the quota to be used, and if it's not, then it gets redistributed in time for November and December, and therefore can be used by other states who have active Menhaden fisheries at that time. So that's a suggestion to the maker of the substitute as a friendly.
Thank you, Dr. Pierce. I think where we are, then, that gives the 2-month window. So let's handle it. Let's handle it this way. We've got a postponed motion which has been substituted, and we've talked about some of the issues with this kind of halfway point where we are with declaring an episodic event but not harvesting any of that 1%, the available 1%. So could we, Mr. Stockwell, might your motion be to substitute to extend the pilot episodic event program until the 2015 annual meeting or further board action, period, if an episodic event is declared before September 1 and not fully used by October 31, any remaining quota will be redistributed to other states and jurisdictions.
If you're good with that as a friendly or a perfection, I'm good with that. My intent was to amend the motion to substitute, not substitute the substitute.
Understood. Pat?
Second, Mr. I like your change and makes it cleaner, Mr. Stockwell.
Does everybody know? David?
Yeah, I think this is a good idea, and I just wonder, from a technical perspective, the bookkeeping, do we feel that we'll know what's available by the end of October to redistribute it in the 2 months remaining? I think if we're under an episodic event, we have weekly reporting, so we should be in pretty good shape to turn that right around, redistribute it, and still provide 2 months of fishing time for the other states.
Yeah, so the provision is daily reporting under this episodic program. And I guess just from a staff perspective, and correct me if I'm reading this motion wrong, is regardless of whether an episodic event is occurring or not, when October 31st hits, whatever is remaining would be redistributed? Or is it if there's an actual episodic event occurring, then it wouldn't get redistributed? I guess that's the only thing that's unclear to me, just because, we've been in a gray area before. I'd rather just get it on the record now.
That's what I was anticipating. I was trying to flip through the assessment and the report to look at landings by month. I couldn't find them, but I think the sense is if it hasn't happened by the end of October, it's not going to happen, so any balance gets shifted and the episodic program is over.
That's the intention of the motion. Walter?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that's correct. I think October 31st gives us plenty of time. And I think this being a pilot program, the onus is on the states that are participating, that want to participate. If they want this program to become permanent, then they have to make sure that it works and that the reporting is done, or otherwise, A, they've got to pay the quota back the following year, or B, the board is just not going to renew the program when we get to 2 years from today and we lose it.
Thank you, Walter. Richie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So if an episodic event is in process and being harvested, but not completed and not fully harvested on October 31st, what happens?
Doug?
With this motion, the way I interpret it is, if you haven't landed it by October 31st, your episodic event is over, and you can't land anymore.
I'm seeing heads nodding around the table. So the episodic event effectively ends Halloween. Representative Abbott, you thought you were being a pain. You were really trying to help me, weren't you? My hat's off to you. I apologize. So, a further discussion on the perfected substitute motion. Joe, perhaps we will read it. The motion is a move to substitute to extend the pilot episodic event program until 2015 annual meeting or further board action. If an episodic event is declared before September 1st and not fully used by October 31st, any remaining quota will be redistributed to other states and jurisdictions. Motion by Mr. Stockwell, second by Mr. Augustine. Further discussion? Doug.
Just for staff, let's say we have an episodic event in Rhode Island and they have daily reporting. Are they reporting that to staff on a daily basis, so you'll have a record on October 31st of what can be, who's going to do the redistribution, and get the other states aware that there's a redistribution and you have X amount of extra quota available?
Yeah, we haven't really put this to the test, but the way we handled it this year is the state of Rhode Island was submitting weekly reports to me, but they had daily reporting. They just were submitting it to the commission on a weekly basis, and I guess I would advocate for that approach. Implement the daily reporting within your state, compile those landings on a weekly basis, send them to the commission. I will track that set-aside quota, and when we come up against that October 31st date, I'll know what's left.
Further discussion. Stephen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm slightly concerned. I like the concept here, but I'm slightly concerned with what Richie said. I mean, Narragansett Bay is far different than Casco Bay, and if they are fishing October 30th in the middle of a large school in Menhaden, we're going to shut these boats down and give that quota to another state? I mean, is there any way we can allow them to finish fishing on that? Can we, I mean, that to me does not make sense. If their episodic event started and they were in the middle of fishing it, we're going to come out midnight and say, all done, guys. We know you still got quota available, but we're going to give it to New Jersey.
Bob? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So if I were to look at this through a different lens and perhaps be one of the states that would be reallocated unused set-aside on or about November 1, given our amount, the proportional amount that we'd receive, it would be so small, and I'm wondering if actually Mike could run through the range of values that we're talking about here. In other words, if the full 1,700 metric tons were not used, what are states what's the range of reallocated amounts that the states are looking at? And the point I'd like to make is I can't imagine how Rhode Island could reopen a Menhaden fishery on 150 pounds of Menhaden or whatever it might be. I think it's going to be a value something like that. It's going to be in the hundreds or thousands of pounds for many states. So I just for the board's edification, would just note the obvious, I think, which is the difficulty of managing a very small amount of Menhaden that are going to be reallocated on November 1. Thank you.
Mike, and then I've got you, Dennis.
The simplest way to answer that would be it'd be either 1% or less than 1% of your quota. And if you want, if you want specific numbers on that, so that's how much you would get back, is either 1%, because that's how much you gave up for this set-aside, or less than 1%, depending on how much was harvested during the set-aside or the episodic event. So obviously that's going to mean different numbers for different states because of what the allocation was based off their historical landings. But I can certainly, I don't know if it's the specific numbers, but yeah, like you said, some states is going to be relatively small because their allocations weren't relatively big to begin with.
Thank you. And just a quick follow-up. So as I understand it, a 75,000-pound quota for Rhode Island would mean 750 pounds back, if I've got that right. So that's just over a daily bycatch allowance. I mean, it's just such a, I'm sorry, it's way below a daily bycatch allowance, which is 6,000 pounds. So we're talking about such a small amount of fish that I just want to make it clear that for many states, while I understand the purpose and I'm prepared to support the motion, the practicality of it, I think, is going to be a challenge in terms of what might happen. And actually, what might happen is there still will be fish left on the table at the end of the calendar year, meaning the states were not able to open a fishery, use the reallocated amount, that sort of thing. And if that's the case, then so be it. Thank you.
Dennis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This whole thing, as I remember, started when Mr. Stockwell wanted to ensure that if the Menhaden came to Maine, that he'd have an opportunity to catch them. And now it seems like it's expanded, and I'm not understanding, I don't know what happened or what method allows you to put a placeholder in to have those, in this case, 1,700 metric tons allotted to, say, in this case, the state of Rhode Island. After you did that and got that allocation available to you, which you didn't use, what would have happened if Mr. Stockwell came along some days later and said, the Menhaden are in Penobscot Bay, and I'd like to catch the fish that I had put provisions in the plan for, but you as the other state says, no, I own those fish right now. Is that my misinterpreting all of that? I'm glad that I am, if I am, because I seem to lose the equity of the whole thing.
Yeah, good question, Dennis. Actually, by any of the states that are qualified to participate in an episodic event, which will be using the criteria that Mike laid out in his earlier presentation, would have access to that additional quota. I mean, so if using the scenario you just described, if Rhode Island triggered the episodic, requested access to the episodic event, Maine or Massachusetts could do the same.
And they would have access to 1,700 until it's caught?
Correct. I mean, this sure has been an issue we beat to death for a number of different meetings. I mean, we didn't expect this year's scenario to come to pass. Lord knows what's going to happen this next year. it's a pilot program, and I'm comfortable with this motion because it addresses the angst of a number of the board members have about this experiment that, frankly, Bob and I have been working on. In order to keep the pilot program alive, I'm prepared to support the motion on the board.
Thank you. Further, Adam.
Thank you. And this would be a question directed to Rhode Island. Because I'm not wholly familiar with the constraints of the Narragansett Bay Menhaden management program, it would seem, at least in reading the Rhode Island information they provided, that if not for the constraints of this program, a lot more fish would have been harvested under the episodic event program, that pilot project that we put together here. So perhaps there can be some information provided about, is this program that they have in place an impediment to the harvest of the fish at this point? Is that something that could be changed? Because it seems to me we wouldn't be having this much discussion if Narragansett Bay hadn't been closed since August. A lot of those fish would have been harvested already.
Bob? Yes, Mr. Nowoski is absolutely right. We could have, had we not had a self-imposed conservation mandate via our Narragansett Bay Menhaden Management Program, which is an ecosystem-based approach to guarding against localized depletion in Narragansett Bay, we would have not only accessed the set-aside, but probably harvested all of it. So in a way, I'd like to suggest that the Rhode Island should be given credit for not, extracting every last pogey from Narragansett Bay, even though it could have under this program. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Further discussions on the motion? Need to caucus? All right, all in favor of the motion, please raise your right hand. Opposed? Raise your right hand. Abstentions? Null votes? Motion carries 16 to 0 to 0 to 0. The substitute motion now becomes the main motion. Further discussion on the main motion. Need to caucus? All in favor of the main motion signify by raising your right hand. Opposed, raise your right hand. Abstentions? Null votes. That motion carries 16 to 0 to 0 to 0. Bob.
Just because sometimes these things do get lost down the road, it seems absolutely clear to me that the intent of the board in supporting this motion is to redistribute in accordance with the proportions that are laid out in Amendment 2. It doesn't say that, but I think it's clear that that's what everybody understands, and I just think it would be helpful to put that on the record. Thank you.
No, Bob, thank you. That's a good suggestion. Yes, in accordance with the distribution schedule in Amendment 2. Pete?
Not on the motion. I had a question for Robert. I was very happy to see you have aerial surveys and a management program for Narragansett Bay and biomass estimates. Does all this get incorporated into the coastwide stock assessment?
Well, I believe so. I hope so. It should. I'm not actually sure about that, but I certainly hope it does. Thank you.
Let me make sure that we're square, that on November 1st of this year, we will reallocate this unused 1,700 metric tons in accordance with Amendment 2. I'm seeing heads nodding around the table. Okay. So be it. Next item on the agenda. Thank you all for good discussion. Technical committee report on the benchmark stock assessment update. Mike?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So as requested at a prior board meeting, we are giving quarterly progress report updates on on the progress of our benchmark stock assessment for Atlantic Menhaden. And in your briefing materials, you received a memo regarding the information that I'm presenting about. And so we are scheduled for a CDAR review and a Menhaden benchmark stock assessment in late 2014. We have had 7 meetings so far, 4 webinars and 3 in person. And the following list is all the topics that the stock assessment subcommittee jointly with the TC have been working on during these meetings. And so we've established the terms of reference for this assessment, which the board has approved. There were preliminary discussions of alternative models, preliminary review of data sets. We have both fishery-dependent and fishery-independent subgroups within the committees that are working specifically on all of the data sets that we've identified for Atlantic Menhaden. And the progress being made is towards the data workshop where the official vetting of those data sets will occur. We've gone over life history parameters. I say we, whenever I say we, I'm referring to the TC and the SAS. And we've also looked at that historic tagging project, which we received funding to make electronic and use of in this upcoming assessment. And so the one in-person meeting that occurred since the last progress report was a September meeting that specifically dealt with life history parameters. All age, length, and weight data were evaluated for growth and selectivity analysis. We did reviewed maturity and fecundity at age data, discussed multiple methods for estimating natural mortality, reviewed the progress toward building the tagging database, and discussed potential analysis pathways for that information. And we assigned a task list for the data workshop. And so the next steps here are, as we head into 2014, our assessment year, in January from the 13th to the 16th, we have scheduled the data workshop. That location is still to be determined, and we will be sending a press release regarding the exact location there. We will follow up with an assessment workshop in summer of 2014 in preparation for the December peer review through the CDAR. And in 2015, if we stay on this course, the results from that benchmark stock assessment will be presented to the board at the February board meeting. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Mike. Questions on the status report, the TC update for Mike? Okay. Seeing none. You got one more thing?
Yeah, I got. So next slide. So I'm also briefing the board on a task from our board chair regarding the review. This is actually for the biological ecological reference points working group that is a spin-off of our multi-species technical group. And they are continuing their progress on the ongoing task to quantify the amount of Atlantic Menhaden biomass necessary to sustain the forage needs of striped bass, bluefish, and weakfish predators at their threshold biomass levels. And so in pursuit of that task, it was recommended to review a recent study that estimated biological reference points for the nutritional status of Chesapeake Bay striped bass. That was a Jacobs et al. Paper. And so the BURP working group had a call to discuss this. They concluded that the science has potential to evaluate management performance through establishing thresholds for nutritional status of the predators. There have been nutritional reference points for striped bass developed for the Chesapeake Bay. And when I say nutritional reference points, this is looking at basically the lipid content of individual fish based on consumption. And the working group in striped bass TC should outline a sampling approach to measure nutritional status on a broader scale. And the measuring of this could be incorporated in the fishery independent monitoring as another indicator for management evaluation. So, for example, as the management board moves towards managing Menhaden in an using an ecosystem-based approach, evaluating the nutritional status of predators that are foraging on Menhaden could be an indicator of how management changes from this board are relating back to the nutritional status of the predators. So it could be one mechanism to measure the progress there. And this approach will be further examined at upcoming meetings in preparation for the 2014 benchmark assessment. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Questions about the biological ecological reference points? The BURP work group. Lewis.
Is this because we don't have anything else to do?
No, the information was provided to me in context of as we continue to move down the road of ecological indicators, trying to manage the species, and the next step as we've taken with Amendment 2. So TC's looking at it.
I guess the thing that just jumps out at me is, I'm not going to say anything about bluegills, but the first thing that comes to my mind is red drum king mackerel cobia. I mean, there are going to be more questions than answers with that information, and we're scrambling to get a peer-reviewed benchmark stock assessment done, and now we're adding sort of ethereal stuff that I'm trying to figure out, is that the best use of our time, effort, and money of our staff too, and our resources to do. I mean, we've already talked about probably spending more money than 1,700 metric tons of menhaden are worth to manage them, and now I think we just, at some point, I mean, again, I bring this up every time we talk about this burp stuff. It doesn't seem to do any good. But again, it's just, I'm not seeing the bang for the buck here.
Further comments? Pat?
I'll be the bold one. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Along with what you said, Dr. Daniel, we're looking at ecosystem approaches, and why are we going there? To your point exactly, we're worried about the food chain. And I would hate to say, wait till MMP gets involved, where we looked at if any of you looked at the viral film that was out there, what was happening to very large schools of bunker off of Montauk, you would have a heart attack. You would have a heart attack. Do any of you know the bluefin whalers? Or finbacks? And two of them going through schools of bunker. And you cannot imagine the devastation in one swoop. And we're going to start thinking about that. The real question is, are we working with single species management, predator-prey relationship, and are we going to start getting into real ecosystem management? And I think he's absolutely right. Our dollars are so tight for everything we have to do. This is a very worthy approach, but is it necessary? And if I can derail this thing, you'll second it, I'm sure. How do we do it? How can we pull that out, at least for this time around, for the importance of this stock report, Mr. Chairman, and is it doable?
Let me, and Lewis, I didn't respond to it. If you look at the term of reference for the benchmark stock assessment, it is a term of reference. And so the question I have for the board is, if we don't want to look at that as a term of reference, then we can go to the TC and say, ignore this BURP. But we've established a term of reference, and I don't know how to start going down that road. I recognize, and Lewis, I appreciate your concern about the resource constraints that we're dealing with, but my sense of things is that we are challenged constantly, daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, to look at some of these issues. We have turned a big corner with Amendment 2, and we have made an explicit decision that we will manage Menhaden differently. And so I don't know how else to continue to go down that road if we can't start looking at these things. So I appreciate everyone's sensitivity to overloading the TC. The benchmark stock assessment is the priority. This is a term of reference in the stock assessment. Walter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate what was said about overloading the TC and how much resources, but we've got scheduled 3.5 hours to talk about striped bass tomorrow. And I've got, a dozen emails from people wanting us to reduce mortality of striped bass. And that does no good. Reducing mortality does no good unless the striped bass have enough high protein food to eat. And so I think it's not just about Menhaden, it's about everything else that we have to manage. And I think if we don't start looking at things on an ecosystem-based management, we're never going to get anywhere.
Richie?
Yeah, I totally agree. And if you remember back to our meeting in Baltimore, there are a lot of people there, and that's what they want. So I agree that there's only so much effort that we have from the technical committee, but I think this is important stuff.
Bill?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I just want to note that we've actually been committed to developing ecological reference points for Menhaden for several years now. The progress has been challenged, of course, because it's been hard. It's a new concept. And we adopted interim MSP-based reference points in Amendment 2, but we also said we were going to continue on a parallel track of developing ecological-based reference points for the long term. And that's how I see this, is just continuing that commitment. So, thank you.
Further comments? Other business. We're down to the other business item on the agenda. Jim Estes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I realize this is probably going to be a can of worms. In fact, I've learned that any can that says Menhaden on it is likely to be a can of worms. We've made a request for consideration of a conservation equivalency. Let me give you a little background. Our TAC, I hear everybody talking about 1% of 1,700 metric tons. Our TAC is 70,000 pounds. And of course, our TAC was calculated from the landings that we had from 2009 to 2011. I think that was a large underestimation, apparently, because we had a lot of underreporting that hopefully we can talk about a little bit later. In 1994, our citizens passed a constitutional amendment that limited our nets in our inshore and nearshore waters to 500 square foot. And what that essentially did was it turned a bunch of fisheries from gill nets for our bait cast nets. So we are allowed we allow our fishermen, because of that amendment and rules we passed subsequently, we allow our fishermen to use the largest thing they can use is a 13-foot cast net. And so our landings from the 80s until since the net amendment in the mid-90s have decreased by over 90%. And so we didn't send this equivalency request in until the first week of October and haven't had a chance for the TC to look at it yet. And what I'm asking is if it would be all right if we scheduled it for our February meeting and I could work with the TC to work out the details about what their recommendation might be.
Thank you, Jim. Questions for Jim on the request for conservation equivalency? Under our process, it again goes to the TC. There it is, where we are resource constrained. Pete?
We're kind of like in the same dilemma. Do you have mandatory reporting for cast netters now? Do you have any idea of the magnitude of what the catch is?
We have mandatory reporting for our cast netters, but they have not been reporting. They claim that they didn't report back in the early 80s and 70s. They have never reported. But now we've talked to a big slug of them in the last 2 or 3 months, and now they are starting to report. And so next year, when we open things up because of the reporting, they're going to blow through their quota in just a little while.
Pete?
Well, I think this is symptomatic of a number of states, and I think I'll let Jim Gilmore speak for himself. But, I mean, he has already brought it to our attention about, they're stuck with a TAC based on the landings in 2009 through 2011. I mean, that's the hand we were dealt. with the understanding that, yeah, we're going to learn a lot once we start implementing these TACs. So this is a great lead into, like, you know, problems that states are encountering in staying under their tax, and were the original tax really very credible to begin with. You know, in New Jersey, we got 42 million pounds, and 39% is easy to track because it's the purse seine fishery, and we can open and close them in a couple of days and stay under that. But it's all the other people, Menhaden as currency on the dock. Underreporting, boy, it's coming out to haunt us big time. So when we, you know, that's what I wanted to hear from other states, that you know, we're going to get by this year with this. Yeah, you reach your TAC, and then you got this 6,000 pound bycatch, which isn't really a bycatch, and it doesn't count against your TAC. Well, those amounts of poundage could be very substantial. And I think we're going to have to start looking at what credible bait landings are in the states. And I know in New Jersey we had laws passed. We got a pretty good system: electronic checks and balances, landing license, dealer license, and then it's like we got all these gill netters that caught Menhaden. They had gill net licenses, and they were commercial crabbers, and there's no reporting on any of them, and they got some substantial landings. So all of a sudden, what do? We tried to come up with a personal use, no sale license. Got to count towards our TAC, but then again, our TAC was not very realistic if all these people never reported any landings. And cast netters, we haven't even gotten there yet. So we may know. It's going to take a couple years for all the cast netting landings to come in, and I think, you know, other states, yeah, how much money are you going to invest to chase after cast net landings, but in order to track your TAC, I think you're going to have to.
All right, any questions for Jim? Further questions for Jim on Florida's request? Dave?
I don't know if it's a question as much as just for clarification, because, I mean, how I've been looking at it, Connecticut has a similar quota to Florida, 0.02%. Directed fishery under this plan is not explicitly defined, but implicitly it's any fishery that would take more than 6,000 pounds a day. So the way I envision managing our fishery is that every pound from the beginning of the year until we catch our quota counts toward the quota. After that, we have a 6,000 pound limit, and you can't come in with more than 6,000 pounds. So unless a cast net fisherman was taking more than 6,000 pounds, it wouldn't affect his operations. And maybe they are, but and hats off to them if they are. But I think the big thing for us now is we need to do that better accounting, because that stuff feeds into the stock assessment and the estimate of biomass. And so now, hopefully, this amendment not only control mortality, but also helps us get a better estimate of removals and a better estimate of the stock. So with that, is there something I'm not understanding about Florida's situation?
Jim?
No, what we did, we met our quota in, I think it was in August this year, and we closed the fishery and we allowed a 1,000-pound bycatch. But I think that's a little bit still, this is a cast net fishery, and I don't know who around here could say that wasn't a directed fishery. We did that just so we could get on top of things.
But to that point, under the plan, you only need to limit them to 6,000 pounds. And you can keep on recording those landings, faithfully report them so we know what's really being removed from the ocean, so we get a better estimate of what the stock is. Because I think the one thing we all agree on is we're underestimating how much the removals are and how big the stock is. So,
Dr. Pierce?
Well, the treatment of the 6,000 is becoming a little bit confused, I think. We have moved forward with the development of our strategies for living within our quota with an understanding that the 6,000 is the bycatch. Therefore, we don't say, all right, fishermen, you can catch your state quota, then after that is 6,000 pounds, go to it, even if you're directing. No, we said it's a bycatch. That's what's made it challenging for us to develop what we accomplished and then implemented. So if you're cast netting for Menhaden, that's not a it's not a bycatch, it's a directed fishery. It should not be allowed. I recognize the problems the states are having living within small shares translated into very small allocations. I recognize that because we, in going over our database and learning more about our fishery after we adopted the Menhaden plan, we discovered that potentially we would have some real problems living within our quota. So we had to be extremely careful with what we did, very careful with what we did, and we ended up with an underage, which, by the way, we're transferring to the state of New York in order to deal with their problem. And we can do that under the conditions of the plan. So it's not, unless every state now is saying that, and the plan is being interpreted as the 6,000 is actually something you can take, bycatch or not, once you take your individual state quota. If that's the case, then it makes my situation in Massachusetts a lot easier when I deal with the fisheries in the fall that are relatively small in nature because they're small pursing, what have you. So, unless I'm wrong, right? But I think I'm right. It's supposed to be a bycatch, not a directed fishery.
Thank you, Dave. That's a good suggestion. And the plan reads a bycatch allowance, just as you've pointed out, for a non-directed fishery. Pat, and then Tom.
To Florida. So what are your folks doing for bait? Are they having to buy it out of state? Is it coming in from another source? Are they just going without? And our people, I know what our people are doing. They're catching them and hoping they don't get caught. I hate to say that, but that's a reality. Our quota's so damn small. But what are you folks doing? I mean, are they going begging or what?
Jim?
They tell me that they are buying them, I think, mostly from Virginia.
And just to follow on, so here we are. You're asking for conservation equivalency. I really don't call it conservation equivalency. We should be asking for coastwide measures because conservation equivalency, state by state, is killing us all. Now, in the arguments we heard last year, we heard the environmental community, plus we knew what was going on with the stock. It was in some trouble. So we reacted and we went ahead, and somewhere through that meeting, emotion boiled over, and we ended up going state by state. And one state, Virginia, gets 80% of it. In the meantime, because our other states, including New York, have been lax in doing our reporting, we're all holding the bag. And we're seeing people who are using bait locally now having to pay twice or three times as much for exactly the same bait from another state that has to come into our state. And that's wrong. And I just see that this is not the time to make a motion to go ahead and create another addendum. But it's got to happen sooner or later because we're going to have a tremendous amount of illegal activity going on. Unless we have the reporting, we're never going to get a handle on what's happening to that stock. And so, Mr. Chairman, I don't know what the action is that we have to go down that road. And you know how I am. I'm very aggressive with trying to create new things. And if it requires me making a move to initiate an addendum to go back and review and readdress what we did with state by state, I'd like to do that before this meeting is over. I do not want it to fall in the crack.
Well, let's do this, Pat. We've got our ISFMP allows a state to request conservation equivalency. Those conservation equivalencies go to the TC. It's one of the things that the TC does for us. So I think the first order of business is we've had a formal request from the state of Florida for conservation equivalency. I think we got to let our process play out with that, and we'll get a report from the TC at our February meeting. But before we go down the other road, are there further questions about or comments on Florida's request or questions of Jim or the state of Florida about their request? Because we're bleeding over into Pete's second. Okay, so Jim, we'll get something from the TC back in February, and the board will mull it and contemplate it and seek collective wisdom. I had Tom Fody. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Is this on the Florida thing, Tom, or is this on other states, catch accountability, underreporting?
Well, it has to do with cast nets, and if you're basically going to look at cast nets and a certain thing, I mean, Pat said illegal fisheries. They weren't illegal fisheries. What they were fisheries that were basically being promulgated for years, and nobody was bothering reports. A lot of it was for personal use, or a lot of it was for trading for different things, or even using for your own bait for crab traps and things like that. It was not an illegal fishery. It was a fishery that we didn't require reporting to. And, you know, we have adjusted this facts for any time we deal with fisheries. We all of a sudden, and I find that every time in the last 30 years that we've gone through a species, and all of a sudden we find landers that we never knew before. It happens to every state and every species that we deal with. And so we should treat it. We should figure out how to basically accommodate those facts. What's interesting, and I always find that we never basically accommodate the stock assessment for all those underreporting landings that were in those stocks to begin with that we never saw. Because if all that fishery was going on for years, then we were underestimating the stock because that's where they are. And that's what I always say when I look at these things. And my fear is when we finally get good recreational statistics on a lot of these, if MREX ever does its job properly, and we give the money to NIMS to do that properly, we will wind up with finding maybe a lot of fishes are underfished, but I would assume that some of them are going to be overfished to a great extent, and they have been for the last 20 years, and yet we haven't accommodated that. And I've asked for a workshop on this for years. How do we deal with these problems on the stock assessment part? Because it ain't meaning that a state goes over quota. It's that the state never reported this, so the quota was smaller than we were estimating that the size of the stock was smaller than beginning with. And I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Next item of other business. Pete, you had asked for, my word, a round robin from the states on some of these issues.
Well, I just wanted to bring up the point that I think in many states, and again, you know, it's not just New Jersey. We had the purse seine fishery, and as I said, 95% of our quota is easy to monitor. It's that other 5% that probably everybody else in here has some kind of variation on. Small gill netting, cast netting, beat seining, whatever it is. And I think it's just my generalized from learning from all the pitfalls that we're encountering in putting in our 5% of the quota and monitoring it, that I think there's just been an overall underestimation of these bait landings and the importance of them in other fisheries. So it might be appropriate at the February meeting, after everybody's gone through. I mean, putting a quota in the middle of the year is like really insane. But even February might be too early. But at some point, yeah, we have to sit down and figure out what this 6,000-pound allowance is. I mean, our gill netters, you know, we can get our 5%, and they can go out gill netting and say, well, I'm targeting bluefish, and I just happen to catch, you know, all menhaden. So I threw a cast net out for mullet. It's not a directed fishery for menhaden. I just caught menhaden. So I think a lot of these things have to be evaluated probably in a future addendum. No time soon. I think we're still learning here under this first year.
Lewis.
Yeah, it does concern me what I'm hearing around the table, because nobody's even mentioned the 12,000 pounds if you have 2 license holders on the boat. And we're managing it precisely the way Dave described, is that we've got a directed fishery that's primarily going to be a trawl fishery in the late winter, early spring, and then through the summer when it's primarily the pound net fishery, we would never close, and they would be able to bring in 12,000 pounds. So I think Tom's idea, or at least trying to get a handle on consistency, but I did want to point out, and I'm not trying to be argumentative, but that's what was brought up in this discussion is precisely my concern about the previous topic, is that we don't even have the landings data right yet. And so, as I was telling Bill, I mean, we're going on separate tracks, I understand, with the ecosystems approach, but we don't have a safe road to travel yet. So that was my point. So, but I think we do need to get a clear understanding around the table, because it sounds like some folks are disadvantaging their fishermen and other states are not.
And if that were happening for my state, I'd be in trouble.
Jim?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Louis, just to your point before about spending effort on maybe unnecessary things, I mean, that's part of the dilemma we've had, and I think I hear from the other states. We're putting so much effort into a relatively small percentage of this fishery and the whole idea was to essentially reduce harvest by 20%. And we're looking at, I mean, if I'm looking and believing the numbers I got right now, I reduced my fishery by 80%, and that wasn't the intent of this. And 80% on 1% of the coastwide landings. I mean, is that doing anything? So, but anyway, and I think we've been on record. I think the problem was this addendum went into place too quickly. We didn't have the data, but we decided to play the game. So at least I can give you a little update of what we did, because we followed the rules and we implemented rules as an emergency rule in July to start getting landings and essentially giving our ability to do quota management. And so that went into effect, but at the same time, we were trying to rebuild our records from the time period for 2009 through 11. So we sent out over 2,000 letters to all the permitted holders, whatever, to try to recreate that data. We got 12 responses, and 2 of the permit holders were actually good data. The other 2 was really stuff that was pretty suspect. 8 of them were, I mean, they made it up out of a shoebox, whatever. So the data was really completely useless. The other thing we did was essentially we were letting the fishery go because, again, what Dave brought up before is we never really had a good definition of a directed fishery. And quite frankly, the thing he said before about any gear that would take more than 6,000 pounds a day, and under that wouldn't be. So most of mine's a cast net fishery, so I don't think I could call it. It's not a directed fishery. So it's so poorly defined. We're trying to come up with what makes sense, and we just don't have the data at this point. So anyway, we've tried to follow what we put in the addendum. It's just not working. So I let my fishery go, and I'm up to about 700,000 pounds of harvest based upon our new rules. And I think, and thanks to the state of Massachusetts, they're going to help us out to get through this year. But we really need to revisit this whole thing, because from what I've heard around the table, most of the states are having the same problem, and we are not getting at the goal of what we originally tried to do. So I think it's a little premature for initiating an addendum at this point, but I think we get to February when we get all the data in, we're going to have to look at that. Thank you.
Bob and then Mike.
Yeah, I don't know if Mike and I are going to say the same thing or not, but it seems like there's 2 dimensions to this question. One is further defining the 6,000 pounds. What is that? Is it bycatch only? Is it directed? Is it not directed? Is it gill nets, not gill net? All those things. And there seems to be, the wording in the plan clearly says it's a bycatch allowance, but I think there's interpretation beyond that. And the other part of that is figuring out how many fish, what's the poundage of fish that was landed in this first year of Amendment 2 under that 6,000 or 12,000 pound provision. And, I'm not sure the reporting rate or reporting requirements within the state, but if staff could get a handle of those landings from each of the states before the February meeting, come back in February and give a summary of what happened under the 6,000 pound, 12,000 pound provision, then I think that would be a pretty good foundation for a board discussion on what is the impact here. And this bait landings issue and underreporting it kind of cascades into the stock assessment. If there was 50%, 100%, 150% more bait landings than we have on record, if you just apply those to the last couple of years and big spike in bait landings, then your F rate's going to spike, and that's really not the reality. Probably bait landings are probably higher throughout the time series. So I think that cascades into the technical committee considering this as a sensitivity type run as they do the next assessment. So I think there's a lot of dimensions to this 6,000 pound thing and the bait issue, but getting a handle on how it went this year and characterizing the catch is probably step 1 for the board discussion.
I think that's a good suggestion. Any objection to that approach, to be looking at that in February? I see heads nodding. David?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Not an objection, but I just want to ask Bob, is that also going to include this? It seems like it's a core issue of consistency of the application. In other words, some states have interpreted that one way and done one thing, and other states have handled it a different way. And I think it would help inform the board's judgment if you knew how each state had handled that issue.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Sort of, clearly spell out how each state handled the 6,000-pound provision this calendar year. And I guess the other part of my plea would be for the states to try to get the best handle on those landings before, I don't know, mid-January, late January, and that, that's going to be tricky for some states due to the reporting timelines and those sorts of things. But the most complete picture we can have for the February meeting would be helpful.
Mike?
Yeah, Bob addressed a lot of what I was going to say, but as of right now, compliance reports for the species are due on April 1st, and so we would be talking about getting this information together prior to that date if we wanted to have that discussion at the February meeting. And going back to Bob's point that the stock assessment team would really like to have 2013 landings as early as possible for incorporation into the benchmark stock assessment as they move forward in 2014. They'd like to include 2013 as a data year in the assessment. So I think the overall take-home message is if we can get that information, if the states can submit that information as soon as possible in 2014 regarding the 2013 fishery, that would be the most useful to evaluate all of these things.
I'll look to the administrative commissioners to take the lead to ensure that we get that so that we have an informed discussion in February. Dr. Pierce.
All right, so this informed discussion in February potentially would lead to a board decision that in 2014, once a state's quota is taken, fishermen can land menhaden in 6,000-pound limits. In other words, that's what some states are doing right now. They're being very liberal with their definition of bycatch. Frankly, I think too liberal and inconsistent with the plan. But I look for a very distinct, a very definite clarification next year, early next year, because if it goes the way I think it's going, we're going to have to modify our regulations in Massachusetts to allow, after we take our quota, a landing of 6,000 pounds maximum in a fishery, whether it's directed or not, for menhaden. Because the cast net fishery directed towards menhaden is menhaden directed, not a bycatch. So I'm assuming that's going to be the outcome, very likely. And so I guess we'll wait and see.
Okay. Thanks, David. Further comments? Lynn?
Yeah, well, I guess I have a comment and a question. The first one is I'm listening and I'm a little, I guess I just wanted to clarify that from Maryland's standpoint, it was our impression that the 6,000 allowance was for gears that are non-directing. So in the state of Maryland, any gear that can move, a gillnet or a trawl or a haul seine does not have a 6,000 pound allowance. That allowance is only going for pound nets. The other thing I guess in this February meeting, there was a motion on the table from our last meeting stating that the 12,000 pound allowance for the two permittees on board would not go forward unless there was specific management action by the board. I think that's what that motion said, if I remember, something to that effect. So it seems to me that that's the other thing that we need to address, that what are we going to do with that 12,000 pound allowance? Thanks.
Further comments? Discussion? Look forward to a vibrant discussion in February. Yeah, we'll put some time aside in February for spirited discussions. Any further business to come before Menhaden? Terry.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's sure not a surprise to me that there are a number of growing pains related to the implementation of this amendment. We've discussed a number of the issues today. The one I referred to earlier is from a state dependent upon menhaden for bait, but recently unable to land any of our own. Quota monitoring is important to us, and I talked to Mike about this once briefly earlier in the season about adding a capacity to our webpage to monitor the quotas, so that, for instance, if a state's about to such as New Jersey, which Maine gets a tremendous amount of bait from, is about to exceed its quota, we have some advance notice. I think it will also be helpful for the board to know a little bit more about these episodic events and whether or not we're triggering them and at what level.
Thanks, Terry. Dennis?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Knowing the toll that being chair of this board has taken, have you been out seeking a vice chair yet?
No, but I think we'll put that on the agenda for February as well. So we'll be recruiting here in Georgia. Pete?
Yeah, to Terry's point, I wish we had known that. That could have been easily accommodated, because when we did close the purse seine fishery, we did it with a very conservative projection, and then it was closed, and then everything settled down, and then we were able to reopen with 2.8 million pounds, and we had another week's worth of fishing. So given the number of calls that we get from people in Maine that want to know about availability, we could just send that letter opening and closing to the ASMFC and for distribution.
Yes, thanks, Pete.
Stephen?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm not sure who this question is directed to, but I've been using Menhaden for bait for 25 years, and this year we're seeing pogies about 4.5 to 5 inches long, and I never used to see them. And I don't know if this is a result of our actions, that the states that are allowed to keep fishing are fishing on a smaller fish than we used to see, or what. But to me, this is something that would be detrimental to what we're doing if now, because some states have more quota than others, the states that are fishing on a smaller fish, and the older fish are dying of old age in the ocean. I mean, I don't understand this. I've never used pogies this small, and I don't know why that's happening.
Walter?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Reading between the lines on Mr. Abbott's question, I'm wondering if he's not volunteering for that position.
We'll note that one as well. Bob?
A question for Terry. Terry, were you making a request that ASMFC keep a sort of up-to-date accounting on the commission website of where everyone stands relative to their state quota?
I don't have a specific request. It's just a thought and process as we continue to work out the kinks here. But I mean, Mike's busy enough. I'd hate to task him with too much more. But perhaps, as Pete suggested, just copying the letter so that it's accessible either on the web page or directly copied to the other states would be sufficient.
Yeah, including closure notices and that sort of thing on our Menhaden section of our web pages, we can definitely do that. I think we may be able to work with ACCSP, and depending on the percentage of Menhaden landings that come through the Safest program, we might, we can look into some accounting sort of tables and evaluate where the states are relative to their quotas. But since Menhaden reporting is pretty new, I'm not sure how accurate that would be, and I don't want to send out sort of false signals that looks like we know what's going on with the landings, and there's a lag in reporting, and our website looks a lot more optimistic than things really are. So we'll look into that and get back to you.
Any help would be terrific.
Pete?
Yeah, just as an FYI on the bait size. Well, you could tell where they're coming from by the age sampling that's done on the resource. And what we're seeing, on the contrary, and what our gill netters are flooding us with, they want these 18-inch bunker. They're catching humongous fish right now in gill nets. And we have a copy. We keep this up in our lab. There's a picture of what they call a mammy shad. This thing was the world record, I think, at the point of 3.25 pounds. So we're catching an unusual number of large fish, and that's good. So we're making sure that we get enough samples and some down to Beaufort.
Further discussion? Seeing none, we will stand adjourned. Mr. Woodward, announcements for this evening.